Brad Johnson, there is a lot of things going on in the Middle East. There were some concerning tweets by President Trump yesterday. I think in the absence of understanding his reference to the Hagia Sophia when he said, my unequaled and magnificent, I forget exactly what he said, but it was a direct quote referring to the Hagia Sophia as it's described. And there's a lot of people that, I mean, I got to tell you the truth, it's been too much for me to catch up on and have any real grip on. So it'd really be great if you could give us some clarity on that.
Sure. So in essence, what we've had is a resurfacing of what was taking place in December. And in December, the president was going to pull out all of our troops, the few remaining, which, I mean, the actual number is classified, I suppose, but it's probably 1,000 or so troops that are there. Not huge numbers, but still significant. And they're going to pull those out, and then what's going to happen is that whole area will be backfilled with Turkish troops who are going to enter into northern Syria, which is on the Turkish southern border there, and they're going to control that territory in Syria. Now, that's an area where ISIS was very active, and where we combined with mainly the Kurds, but there were a few Syrian troops that were also in that area working in conjunction. But it was mainly the U.S. with the Kurdish troops that did all the fighting and basically destroyed most of ISIS. Now, out of all of that, there are many tens of thousands of refugees, Syrian refugees in Turkey, which is actually part of the impetus for Turkey to try and do something about this. So all of this was set in place in December, and everybody pitched a fit because what we'd essentially be doing is opening up the Kurds who remain in that northern area of Syria open to attack. I mean, that's where they're from. So that would leave them open to attack from these Turks. And since Kurds were our allies, that was something that there was quite a little bit of pushback. So that got stalled until now, and now it's come back up again. And Turkey has taken a very hard position. We've talked quite a little bit about Turkey in previous interviews. Erdogan, who's definitely got expansionist tendencies and interests, is now saying, look, I'm going in with or without your permission, and you got 1,000 troops in the way, and we're rolling through. And so I think essentially what he did, Erdogan, was force President Trump's hand. And he put President Trump in a position where Trump would either have to respond with force to keep Turkey in check, or pull out the American troops and let them come in. And I think Erdogan read Trump correctly, that Trump has long said that he doesn't like these incursions. And let's keep in mind where this came from. This was all Obama's plan to take out Assad, President Assad, in Syria. Well, royal failure just came apart at the seams, and we've been left with this mess and have had troops there ever since the Obama regime. So that's the kind of the situation that Trump inherited, and he's always said he wants U.S. troops out of these sorts of things, and doesn't like us being involved in these incursions where we've got troops out there with no specific goal and no end in sight. He wants to protect the Kurds, I think, but how is it? Leave troops in Syria forever? And where we're sort of a minor player, where the Russians are so much bigger, and the Iranians and all of the other actors have a much bigger part in the situation there than we do. So it's very far from home, and all of the logistics are more difficult, and so on. So it's just a situation where it's very difficult for us to be any sort of significant player, which is why we were down to such a small number of troops, say 1,000 or so, and they were basically there kind of as a tripwire protecting the Kurds. So I think it was kind of an untenable situation from Trump's perspective. I think Erdogan looked at it and said, I can get my way because I'll just say I'm going to go in. What are they going to do? Attack us? Turkey always acts under the belief that we, the United States and the West, need them. And so we have to have them. So they view negotiations as they hold all the cards. Now, if I were in the National Security Council, I think one of the things I would suggest, which I'm not there, and I don't think they would have me. But if I were to be talking to them, I would suggest that, look, we need to take a look at Turkey's kind of zero sum and take a look at them from beginning to end again and just see how good of an ally they are. Do they belong in NATO? Do they not belong in NATO? Now, they're a large country, big army, decent training and equipment and all of those things. So they're a force to be reckoned with and considered. But the problem is that Erdogan is definitely interested in reestablishing essentially the Ottoman Empire. Now, the way it's being discussed is they're talking about now, for example, pan-Islamic republic. Pan-Islamic meaning that now, in the last year in particular, Turkey's been talking about, well, Sunni and Shia, all belong under this one, new Ottoman Empire, and it shouldn't be fighting between, and it's, we have to have a pan-Islamic empire. And oddly enough, they've got some strange bedfellows because that's what Iran is preaching as well. So we've seen a situation develop that I think is in essence playing out in Syria, where Iran and Turkey have kind of come to agreement over some of how to proceed in the world, and Syria is one of them. So it's going to be a situation where Turkey has demanded this 300-mile long, which is the length of the border with Syria and Turkey, and 20-mile deep buffer zone. And they're going to take all those tens of thousands of refugees and put them in there. And that's where their home will be. And then that is intended, therefore, to be a buffer between the Kurdish zone and and Turkish, so that the PKK can't operate in those areas and attack and so on. So it's a buffer zone, I think, is just the precise situation that Turkey has in mind. Now, they'll come into that area. They're going to enforce all that. That means that inside that zone, they then have these surrogates that will be able to fight with the Kurds and with Turkish backing and equipment and training, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's essentially the game plan as the Turks plan to play it out. And I think what they've sold to the United States is that, we're going to do this as a buffer zone to stop the fighting. Now, I think, like I said, Trump basically really didn't have a good position to do much with. It was either, stop using the military, stop the Turks when they come across the border, or get out of the way. And he chose to get out of the way, which, attacking the Turks in NATO country would be a pretty major step and a kind of a dangerous development. So I think he's done what he could do. Now, he has drawn a line in the sand. He has said, if you start taking out the Kurds, we're going to respond. So I don't think that'll make much difference. I think the confrontation between the Kurds and the Turks is a given. So I think it's going to be, I think Trump better be prepared to show some strength and some military strength. And I'm not sure. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Trump is declared by everyone to be, some wacky fanatic, trying to use the military might all around the world. But the fact is actually the opposite. There's been a number of times where the U.S. drone was shot down, for example, and we were within an hour of striking back at some Iranian targets and as a counterattack after they were shooting down our drone, and he decided not to. And we just saw Iran also attack, ships in the Hormuz, Straits of Hormuz, and we've seen them bomb the oil facility, the production facility in Saudi Arabia, their largest one. And so far, there has been no military kinetic action taken in revenge, if you will, to push back. So I think this is where we'll find out, because there's really, is he just going to let them come in and just start killing all the Kurds? Because I think that's the way this is headed. I don't think there's a lot of doubt as to how this will proceed. The Turks will come in, they'll take over those areas, they'll set up their own militia, and they'll start attacking the Kurds. Or they'll find a provocation to attack the Kurds. The Kurds will be, defending themselves, hoping to stay out of trouble, but I just don't think that's going to happen. Now, on top of all that,
before you go further,
sure.
I've been watching Turkey, when possible, for the last 5, 6, 7 years, and typically, whenever there's news out of Turkey that they have eliminated terrorists or arrested terrorists or killed terrorists, a euphemism for going into a Kurdish village and slaughtering people.
Yeah, that's right.
So
that's
the Turks have a grand plan for the genocide of the Kurds in that area. It seems clear that they're doing that. And I think that President Trump's base both expect him to live up to his promise, which he said, and stop engaging in this constant stuff in the Middle East, but also expect that he should defend our allies when we did go in there and deal with the Islamic State, which were the Kurds. So, like you say, he's going to have to be prepared. But he's also saying that he can destroy the Turkish economy, and he was really clear about that in yesterday's tweets.
Yes, yes, and I think he could. I mean, Turkey's far more intertwined with the West and the United States, being a member of NATO, than, say, Iran. So, yes, absolutely. If the president turns the screws to him, and that gives him a non-kinetic, if you will, a non-military response to Turkey doing such a thing, he absolutely can bring their economy to a standstill. But now, again, being an observer of Erdogan in particular in Turkey, I'm not so sure that Erdogan cares about, any sort of economic stress. I'm not sure that would be a deterrent from his perspective. He wouldn't like it, but I think what he would do is just double down, act twice as fast, kill all the Kurds that he has in mind killing, and then when he's done, go, oh, okay, sorry, misunderstanding, we won't do it anymore, because he's accomplished whatever his goals were when he set out. I think a scenario along those lines is what's more likely. So I would like I said, I'll repeat. I think the president needs to be prepared for some military support for whatever his solution is, and direct use of military force, I think, needs to be well thought through and planned, and try to defend a lot of these, as you say, the villages and so on that are going to be slaughtered. They'll just come in and kill them all. I don't think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what the intent of Turkey is here. And what I was going to say, just on top of all of this too, ISIS is not. They were defeated as a force on the field, but they're not gone. And so you have these some of these tent villages, tent towns, with 70,000 people in them and things that are controlled by ISIS. And this has been in the press, to some degree or another. But ISIS is recruiting and developing followings within these places, and there's tens of thousands of these refugees that are going to be settled in that so-called buffer zone. But also, the Kurds and the Americans have 10 to 15,000 ISIS prisoners that were captured on the battlefield. So right now, those guys are sitting in holding camps and so on. They're being fed and have medical care and all that sort of stuff. But what happens with them when the Turks come in? Really, there's kind of two possible things that would transpire at that point. If the Turks move into those zones, which is where they say they'll be, they either kill all those guys or they let them go. Both of which are, really bad solutions. Just coming in and murdering 10 or 15,000 people, I don't know of anyone that's going to support that type of solution, at least in the West. And also, letting them all loose, they're just going to go right back into the fighting. And, you have a 10 or 15,000 standing force that you're then able to supplement with all of these people and backing that you've recruited out of these camps where the people are being held. And you've got a standing army already on the field. And I think I don't know. This part I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised now that you see a kind of overlapping of interests between Iran and Turkey, that you wouldn't see them cooperate to the degree that these then militias, if you will, ISIS militias, then just all concentrate on wiping out the Kurds. So hard to say how that will all play out. Also, just throwing another little weird wild card into it, that's something that most people don't focus on at all, is Antifa. Antifa had a brigade of people that they've been sending into that area that were fighting with their socialist brothers, the PKK. They were fighting with the Kurds and had intended to establish kind of a free zone for them, some sort of socialist paradise Antifa version in that area in northern Syria. And so they were sending in maybe 500 or so guys that were fighting. A lot of those guys got killed because they were sending in people that just they weren't fighters or anything. But the ones that survived now are, and they now all have training, certainly in tactics and have combat experience and all of that. So it just begs a lot of questions. Why really does Antifa want a cadre of combat trained and experienced veterans, essentially, in their number? I mean, where are those guys all going now? I mean, I don't think they're there anymore. Have they all come back to the U.S.? Are they spread around the world? And are they then now being used to train new recruits coming in? I mean, why does Antifa want combat troops? Now, Antifa's talked about it. They've got photographs out there of them with their flags fighting alongside the PKK, and they've openly discussed it. It's like I said, it's not covered at all in mainstream media. You do find it in other places, and if you just Google it, you'll see Antifa and its photographs and them openly discussing their being there and that they're fighting and what the type of things they've done. So you throw that into the mix too, and there's just so much going on there. I know a lot of people are very critical of the President Trump, for what he's done there. But as I said, with what he was faced with, and again, this wasn't a problem of his creation. This is a problem from the previous administration. This was all set in place by Obama. Trump inherited this and is trying to figure out what to do. And he would have never gone into this in the first place. So I think everybody, like I said, I don't hear anyone really arguing that we want to abandon the Kurds and let them all die. Nobody's arguing that. And I think where we will find out is because Trump basically was faced with an untenable situation, he made the best choice he could make, and then has made the counter threats to Turkey if they overstep the bounds and just start slaughtering innocents. So that remains to be seen, whether economic sanctions are something that would be effective, just how harsh Trump is willing to go against a NATO ally of Turkey. My prediction out of all of this, which is always going out on a limb to do such things, but I don't think Turkey cares about any of that. I think they're going to go in there and kill the Kurds. I don't think they care what anybody says. I don't think there's any confusion over their plan and what they're going to do and how they're going to carry it out. I think they've essentially already laid all the pieces in place using these militias and bringing in all of the fighting people there that they can, and they'll just let them. They'll just turn them all loose until every Kurd is dead. It takes a while for economic sanctions to really kick in and really have full effect. Takes a little bit of time, and I don't think it's going to take Erdogan that long to do it. I think his ambitions are clear, and I think absorbing northern Syria is clearly part of what he has in mind, and it's on the road to reestablishing the Ottoman Empire. And I think that's also part of why you see Erdogan, particularly in the last year or two, has started making these arguments about a pan-Islamic state, where it's, under the Ottoman Empire, you had both Sunni and Shia in the different places within the empire. And, they had their problems, I suppose, but they also coexisted under one country, if you will. And I think that's what he envisions going back, or going forward, rather. So I think it's one big smelly pile of doo-doo, and that President Trump is trying to do the best he can with the cards that he was dealt. And the only thing I would urge the White House to consider is be prepared for economic sanctions not to be enough, and be prepared to have to use force and kinetic energy, the military force, to stop the Turks from just wiping out every Kurd they can get their hands on. Now, also, there's some Christian villages in those areas, and I don't think it's going to play out much better for those guys than it would for the Kurds. I think they're in a common boat and going to pay the same price.
So this is related. According to the CEO of Stratfor Strategic Research, it's I guess it's a lot of ex-Intel people that formed a private think tank for an Intel service, if you will, for companies and so on. And according to, I forget his name, but the CEO of Stratfor, he was saying in his book, The Future of War, that for the last 100 years, American grand strategy has been to make sure that there are no hegemons in Eurasia. And he explains Vietnam that way. He says Vietnam wasn't a loss. It was making sure that it couldn't rise as a regional hegemon. And what I'm wondering is, I mean, everything you're saying makes perfect sense, and it seems like the best decision under the circumstances, and I do think the United States is holding more cards than people realize, so that should Turkey decide to do certain things, they might find that their belonging to NATO does them more harm than good. So, okay, that's great. But what I'm wondering is if this doesn't also represent a grand strategic change, assuming that the Stratford fellow is right about this, because the disengagement from the region means that Turkey and or Iran both can become regional hegemons.
Yes, it does. And I think that's what I think that when I talked about the overlapping interests between Turkey and Iran, I mean, I think that is, in fact, the overlapping interest, is that they, I think ultimately they both are looking to create this with two separate centers that will expand outward. And most assuredly, Turkey's planning on expanding into Europe. I think Iran has clear goals regionally as well, for Arabia, if you will. And so they've got their two separate kingdoms growing from their perspectives. And I think at some point they look at it and go, yeah, we can cooperate until our two borders meet. And then at that point, Erdogan's thinking, then I will have you by the short hairs and absorb you. And I'm sure the mullahs are thinking the exact opposite, that they'll absorb Turkey. So whether that would turn into some sort of gigantic shooting war or how exactly that would play out remains to be seen. And of course, I don't think that they'll ever actually get that far. But you never know. I mean, you just never know. That's one thing about the future. It's hard to predict accurately. But I think that's what their intentions are. And I think a level of cooperation between them is actually very beneficial to them both to be able to pursue those plans. So I would say Turkey is far more dangerous of the two because Iran is essentially ruling against the will of its people. And so there's always a place in Iran for an uprising and something where they could replace the current government with more normal democratic style government. It has not been that long ago. Most adults, say over 50, will remember what it was like under the Shah, which was a much better, stronger, safer place to be in Iran. So many of the adult population remember that firsthand. So that does not exist per se in Turkey. I mean, following World War I and II, Ataturk came to power in Turkey and established a normal civilian type rule government, not an Islamic state. But I think you're going to see that fade away quickly because Erdogan does not allow competition for power. And even a dead Ataturk with an enormous tomb in the capital of Ankara in Turkey is not going to be allowed to stand forever. I mean, Erdogan's going to have to get rid of the memory of Ataturk to the best of his ability and move him to some. I don't know that he would go to the trouble to destroy the body or anything, but he's going to do something else with that tomb the first chance he gets because he doesn't want that competition. And the Turkish people, they're not the same as the Iranians looking at the current regime. They've got that long history of the Ottoman Empire, and there's a natural kind of hearkening back to that period of greatness of the Turkish people. So he's got a far more friendly audience in Turkey than the Iranians.
We see evidence of that with the gray wolves all over Europe.
Yeah.
Also, the fellow I was thinking of was George Friedman, who wrote The Future of War, which he talks about that strategy. I just feel like I ought to get that.
Okay.
You know what? I think the big takeaway from sitting at home position would be, holy cow, Antifa's actually looking for combat experienced guys, and what are they doing? And given the history of leftists throughout, since Marx, we know exactly what it is they're planning to do, and It's ugly.
Also, too, now this is something. One final kind of point on precisely that. Uh, the left has been doing these. The extreme left has been doing those sorts of things as well, sending people out that they gain experience and have get combat time. And what we're seeing here that's very interesting is we're seeing this cooperation between groups like Antifa and Islamic groups. And that's a growing concern as well. And we've also seen now, for I guess it's probably 2 years ago now, maybe a little more, that the FBI came out with a report warning of such things, that there was cooperation taking place between terrorist groups and Antifa. And that, once again, their interests overlap in many ways. They have many common goals and methods. So they're in many ways natural allies. So those type of alliances are really present a danger because of the different type of support in different areas and where they can go in. I mean, Antifa is essentially has membership in a lot of countries. So Antifa in the United States is made up mostly of Americans, and Antifa in Australia mostly Australians. Antifa in Germany, Germans. So they have local people that know the culture and the language and all that because they're from there. So that represents a risk to all the rest of us, I think, in the long run. So, I mean, this whole thing, it has a lot of implications outside of just this little strip of, of northern Syria. And you've got a lot of players. And this could, if this conflict expands in any way, when you have Syrian troops become directly involved, and if they start losing, like let's say for example, any scenario to play with, but let's say the Turks and the Syrians start facing off. Well, the Turks would clean up the Syrians. So would the Russians allow that? Probably not. So then you would have, the Turks and the Russians have had a lot of problems through the centuries. So they would be kind of inclined to fight each other, I would think. I mean, I don't know what their attitudes are, today towards each other, but those are types of things that could be a fairly realistic scenario. Excuse me, depending. So there's other types of play here that could make this conflict grow into a much wider sphere. I'm not suggesting World War III is just around the corner because of this, but what you were talking about, regional hegemon, but also regional conflict. You don't want any of those sorts of things taking place because they're just so dangerous when you start having different allied countries coming in and this thing starting to grow. It's not like the limited fighting that we've seen in Yemen between the Saudi-backed and the Iranian-backed groups, basically fighting each other. This would be quite a little bit different just because you have, you're going to have some frontline Turkish troops in there. And who they're going to be fighting against and what they're going to do and all of that. And do we stand by if they just start slaughtering our allies, the Kurds? And economic sanctions, are they going to, if the Turks line up everything, get all the troops in there and just wait for the right day when they have all the gasoline and food and stocks ready and they just start rolling, and we do economic sanctions the next day, how long is it going to take for those to kick in versus how long it would take them to roll through the Kurds with their tanks and armored vehicles and air superiority and all of that? So I think Erdogan is well aware of all of that, and presumably, the Americans are too. But I think that's a huge risk, and I think it's a very dangerous risk. I think there's a very good chance we'll see something along those lines. I mean, Erdogan can be patient, but Erdogan one by one just goes after everybody. I mean, even groups that aren't really related to seeking power or having really political influence or politicians and so on.
Well, Turkey is also doing the Kuwaiti-style drilling into Greek waters, isn't it? For oil?
Yes. Yeah. So we'll see. I mean, they're even going after the Gulen people and blame them for revolutions and all this sort of stuff. But bottom line out of that is Erdogan controls Turkey. He owns all the guns. He owns all the intelligence agencies. He runs the government. It's all under his strict control. He has a relatively friendly audience with the Turkish people who like the idea of going back into a position of great power and influence that they had under the Ottoman Empire. So he's in a good position to move forward. And I think this is just one more thing he's doing. And the way he kind of absorbed Muslim Brotherhood and is working his way back into Europe in a big way, I think his plans are working out quite well. And I don't know, I don't hear people have this conversation that we're having right here at all. This isn't discussed in mainstream media. Nobody's looking at that. I mean, this guy's dangerous. That was more or less Hitler's plan, just start absorbing back in the Germanic people and then expand and keep pushing outward and outward. And so the first time somebody tries to stop, you just roll over them. So there's some parallels there as to what the goals are. And we're seeing this out of the Chinese as well, who certainly have a lot of ambitions to have a lot more influence and certainly be a major power and controlling power in Asia. So, do their ambitions stop there?